Awesome.
Okay, there it is.
So last but certainly not least today, we have Tiffany Ray Reed, who is joining us from Voorhees, New Jersey. And she's going to be sharing Colorblind, which is sort of a memoir, sort of a nonfiction life story about her experiences growing up biracial, which I think is something that this Mallory community can really relate to. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bringing my feather with me because I'm into this right now. And I just want to thank you all for coming out. This has been an absolutely wonderful experience. And just listening to what Edie had to share with us, thank you for that, because there is so much that you said that resonates. And especially with The Wizard of Oz, I think I'll start there by introducing my book. You know, I think having grown up in an all-white Hungarian household, most of my formative years were spent in black and white, not really understanding the role of color as it related to me, as it related to my peers, or how society really works. And having been raised in an all-white Hungarian household without access to my parents of color, I never really came to understand until my late 20s when I found out that I was of color, what that meant, and why it was the missing piece for me. And you know, as a life coach and mentor to the biracial community and to women and men in transition, I didn't really know what I had to offer. When I received my certification, I joined the ranks of, I don't know, 10,000 other life coaches in Jersey alone, probably. And it was because of this young man, Philip Saunders, that I really had to you know, delve into what it was about myself that made me unique, that other people would come to me for something very specific. And what that caused me to do was face a lot of demons, because I didn't, growing up, being biracial in an all-white world, it wasn't cool. And I constantly ran from it. I didn't know how to dialogue about it. I was still coming to terms with trying to discuss it with my mother. Discussing situations that hurt me, discussing her lack or inability to see color, and then it hit me. And I realized that by talking about these very personal things, I felt that I could be available for other people who needed to talk about these issues. And in this very global world, diverse world that we live in, I'm not shocked at how well received the topic is, but what really warms my heart is the fact that parents, caregivers, family members raising biracial children are open to hearing the life experience of someone who was raised in an all-white world, so that they can better prepare themselves for the obstacles, challenges, and absolute wonders of raising mixed race or biracial children. So out of all of that came Colorblind, a mixed girl's perspective on biracial life, which is, in fact, a culmination of my life stories, wherein I try to provide instances of, man, in this situation, I wish my mom would have said this, or I wish she didn't wait until I was 26 years old to tell me that my father was African American. So in that way, it's come to be a sort of resource and guide for parents, caregivers, family members raising biracial children, and educators impacting the lives of biracial children in the classroom. So I have chosen to read a chapter from Colorblind that takes place after the very first time I heard a fellow kid on the playground, on the basketball court, use the N-word, and realized he had directed it towards me, and I didn't understand its impact. I felt something, but I didn't understand the actual impact of it. And so right after this experience, I document my life. In Chapter 5, Secrets and Dreams, Replacing Truth with Fantasy. Very soon after this experience, I remember books becoming my best friend. My appetite was voracious, and I began to read everything that I could get my hands on. I would escape from the reality that was waiting for me every time I opened my front door by losing myself in a book. I began to read books about people from other countries and their experiences inside and outside of the world that I knew. I began to read about people who looked very different from me. I had a hard time understanding why the book titles read black instead of white. My awareness of being different continued to increase exponentially. I began to feel like everyone was keeping secrets from me. My mother, my family, even people at my church. I didn't know why, they just wouldn't tell me what was really going on. The feeling only got worse when other people of color came around. With every skin tone of color that I saw, I would start to imagine that maybe, just maybe, white and black meant something more than what I saw in my box of Crayola crayons. I felt my tummy tumble when people of color made comments about the color of my eyes being so green or the texture of my hair being so good. I never knew what they really meant. Comments like, "She's a red bone, all right," would really scare me. Actually, my desire to become a doctor was initiated right there on the spot the first time I heard someone say this to me. I was determined to see inside of a human being in order to see whether it was possible for our bones to actually be red. So it's obvious that even at that early age, I always knew that I was different in some way from my sister and my mother. As different types of experiences began to add up, though, I began to notice many more of the similarities between people whose skin was colored white as compared to those whose skin was colored black. In my apartment community and neighborhood in and of itself, whites and blacks would get drunk and yell a lot, sometimes together or at each other. I would hear white parents and black parents swear at one another, and I noticed that if we took away skin color, all of these individuals pretty much acted and sounded the same. They smoked, they danced, they took their kids roller skating. I even met some white people and some black people, but not many black people, who seemed to feel the same way I did about the New Kids on the Block and Miami Vice, well, mostly just Don Johnson. Although at the age of 10 or 11, I never thought in terms of race, the similarities between whites and blacks kept me questioning my racial identity, especially when my whiteness was challenged. I didn't start focusing on the many and sometimes obvious differences until more kids started showing up and would remind me of just how different I really was. Are you adopted? Is your daddy black? Good questions. I just didn't have any answers. And this is the root of many of the problems that biracial children can develop when being raised and nurtured by loving and colorblind parents. Well, I began to notice and stress out about all of the differences that existed between me and my mother and sister. They all seemed to go unnoticed by my mother. So, like most children tend to do, I started to replace the truth with fantasy and began to daydream big time. When I found myself at church surrounded by a wonderful congregation that allowed my mother the leeway to live in her altered reality, I enjoyed times of peace. This sense of peace lasted only until a black evangelist would be invited to our church to preach the gospel or sing. Then it seemed like all eyes were on the little token black girl sitting in the pew next to the heavyset white woman. While their gazes told me that they were trying to figure us out, I responded with empty eyes, allowing my mind to iron out the details of the daydream that went a little something like this. Curly-haired mixed girl separated from black birth mother 10 years ago, found when birth mother joined church ministry and returned to town 10 years later, only to find her long-lost child sitting in a pew of the very church the mother had attended before her baby was stolen. Curly-haired mixed girl reunited with singer-songwriter mother, and come to find out the young girl can sing too. Then the song would end, or we would stand for the customary prayer at the conclusion of the service, and I would be reminded of my existence parallel to that of my mother's reality. Here I was, back to the gazes and the looks on the traveling ministers' faces that said, "Poor little girl, her mother doesn't even know how to do her hair." Yes, there was always that. There was always the image of me standing with my mother in front of our bathroom mirror, trying to determine what to do with my tight mass of curls. While I was quietly screaming on the inside, and sometimes on the outside, she would hold me by my shoulders as she used a pick to make my hair really, really big. Then, to add insult to injury, she would force barrettes onto the sides of my head and send me out to the hungry wolves in the very confused world in which I lived. Now, I believe that my mother thought that she could use a pick on my hair because her best friend was married to a Puerto Rican man whose best friend was mixed, and he walked around picking at his hair all the time. I know that somewhere in my mother's altered reality, she probably liked the image of this guy picking away at his Puerto Rican hair and thought, hey, that's what I can do with Tiff's hair. Well, if I didn't even know what I should have been doing to my hair, how could I possibly hold that one against my mom? To this day, my hair is my Achilles heel. It's one thing that reminds me of my biracial struggle. of the days when I truly believed that I was white, and it reminds me of my biracial struggle even now that I know I have some black in me too. The type of daydreaming that I used to escape uncomfortable situations didn't stop at church. I remember riding in the car with my mom when front seats weren't separated, and you had to move the whole front seat forward. Remember those? If you wanted to get in or out of the back seat. We would be riding in the car, and before she knew what was happening, I would scoot over and change my mother's radio station, rolling the dial all the way over to the left and slowly back toward the right. I would never get too far before she would slap my hand away and move the dial back to her pre-selected station. It didn't matter though. Before she had a chance to change the station back, even if only 5 words of an R&B song were uttered, my mind would be off and racing to a faraway place where everyone looked like me, welcomed me, and wanted me. I would picture the appearance of a black superstar after hearing it announced that he was coming into town for a concert. I would see him ride up in his limousine and claim me as his own. He would take me shopping and get my hair done. We would make the concert venue just in time for him to bring me up on stage after the curtain was raised to announce to the whole world that he had found his long-lost daughter and wanted everyone to take a good look at his good little girl. Critics and fans alike would express their joy and happiness at their favorite singer of all time finding his long-lost daughter. They would turn to each other in their rows of seats and remark, "And she can sing, too." From a very early age, I've been unable to address my mother about the identity of my father. I never knew that I had a right to ask my mother about my father, his color, or rather, about my color. For this reason, I believe I began to hang out with my best friend who was Puerto Rican. We immediately established a comfort level that soothed a part of me that craved to know the reason for many of my differences. I learned to speak Spanish fluently at a very young age and loved being able to speak Spanish with my best friend in the presence of both white and black people, especially my mother. In these situations, I would come to understand years later that what I loved most about those moments was the utter lack of attention that I received from a community that accepted me for me and appreciated the effort I took to learn about them, their culture, and their language. Hanging out with my Puerto Rican friend's family, I no longer experienced the forlorn stares and the "I feel sorry for you" gazes. No one looked to me and then to my mother or to my friend with curious eyes and disgusting faces. I would let them assume that, just like my friend, I was some sort or degree of Spanish descent. Of course, the situation always came to an end, but in my head, with the force field of an imagination that I had built, the scenarios never stopped. Even in my adult life while working in New York City, if someone mistook me for a person of Hispanic or Latino descent, I never questioned or challenged their misconception or belief. My mental escapes began to alter my own precious reality. I assumed that this happened in just the same way as my mother's reality had been altered over a longer period of time. I was somebody else too often in my own mind that I was somebody else so often in my own mind that I would sometimes secretly wish that my mother wouldn't show up after school to pick me up or wouldn't clap for me at school performances. At least this way I could avoid the stares that she seemed too willing herself to ignore or endure. Just because my mother was able to avoid confrontation with nosy neighbors or intrusive family members didn't mean I was so lucky or able to do the same. With each birthday, I was often confronted by groups of increasingly aggressive adolescents. These kids continued to demand, sometimes in earshot of their parents' prodding, to know who and what I thought I was. They would catch me alone on the playground or walking in the woods and surround me, requiring me to provide an explanation as to why my mother was white. In my head, I would hear my mother telling me to run away, but something in my heart would not let me. Without a second thought, I was pushing back and picking up rocks and sticks, readying myself for a final defense. To understand the repercussions of being mixed and raised in a colorblind household, it is important that we discuss what it actually means to be colorblind.